Have you ever looked across the living room, caught a glimpse of your husband in his favorite chair, and felt a wave of irritation one you can't quite explain? Maybe it's something small. The way he chews, how he repeats the same story again and again, or how he doesn't seem to notice when you need help around the house. You love him, of course. You've shared decades, children, heartbreaks, laughter, and routines. But lately, something shifted. And it's not just you. Many women, as they grow older, begin to feel disconnected from their husbands, sometimes even resentful. And the reason? It's surprisingly simple. Before we dive into it, I want to gently invite you to stay with me through this conversation. You may find pieces of your own story tucked between these words. And maybe, just maybe, you'll walk away feeling a little lighter, more understood, and with a few tools to make the next chapter of your relationship one filled with peace instead of pressure. Because after all, you deserve that. Now, let's get back to that feeling, that quiet, growing frustration. What causes it? Why do so many women in their 60s, 70s, and beyond start to feel distant from the very man they once couldn't imagine living without? It's not a matter of falling out of love. It's not even always about big betrayals or deep incompatibilities. The truth is much softer and more human. Over time, life piles up. Years of caretaking, raising children, managing households, and often putting your own needs on hold for the sake of others, it wears on the spirit. Many women spend the bulk of their lives nurturing children, nurturing a partner's dreams, nurturing everyone else's emotions. And by the time we reach later life, many of us begin to feel an emptiness, a sense of having lost touch with ourselves. It's in that space of reflection, once the busy noise of daily life quiets down, that things bubble to the surface. Things we didn't have time to deal with in the chaos of earlier years. It could be unspoken grievances, emotional neglect, or just a lack of real companionship. And often, the person sitting across from us, our husband, is the easiest one to point to. Not because he's the villain in the story, but because he's been the constant presence through it all. Dr. Harriet Lerner, in her book The Dance of Anger, describes how women often carry unresolved anger in relationships, not just loud anger, but quiet, chronic discontent. And this discontent isn't about the toothpaste left uncapped or the socks on the floor. It's about feeling unseen, unheard, unvalued. As women age, they become less willing to tolerate being emotionally invisible. There's a clarity that comes with aging, a bravery even. And many women find themselves thinking, if not now, when? If I don't speak up for my needs, who will? You see, as we age, we change. Our priorities shift. What mattered in our 30s or 40s doesn't always hold weight in our 60s or 70s. We want peace. We crave emotional intimacy over physical attraction. We long for mutual respect, meaningful conversation, and someone who truly sees us not just as a wife or a helper, but as a full person. And if those needs aren't met, if they never were, it becomes harder and harder to ignore. Let me share the story of Elaine, a woman I met during a community workshop on emotional aging. Elaine was 72. She'd been married for 48 years. Her husband, Ron, was a good man, by most accounts faithful, dependable, hardworking. But as she sat with her hands folded in her lap, she told me quietly, I don't think he's ever really known me. She wasn't angry. She wasn't bitter. She was just tired. Tired of decades spent asking for emotional closeness and getting a nod or a grunt in return. He loves me in his way, she said, but I've always had to carry the emotional weight of this marriage. And now I don't want to carry anything heavy anymore. Elaine's words struck me, not because they were rare, but because they were so common. Her experience echoed what so many women have confided. The dislike that grows with time isn't about hate or even true dislike, it's about unmet, emotional needs that have finally made their voices heard. And unfortunately, many husbands simply weren't taught how to meet those needs. They grew up in generations where emotional expression was discouraged, where men were providers, not nurturers. So when their wives began asking for deeper connection, they didn't know how to respond. And after years of feeling shut down, many women simply stop asking. This leads to emotional loneliness, a quiet but deep ache. And loneliness in a marriage can feel even worse than being alone, because you're sharing space with someone, but not sharing yourself. And the longer that goes on, the harder it becomes to bridge the gap. But here's the good news. It's not too late to understand what's happening and gently begin the process of healing. Part of that begins with awareness. Just recognizing that the frustration or sadness you're feeling is valid and that it has roots in real emotional needs. You are not too sensitive. You are not asking for too much. Wanting to feel emotionally connected, valued, and truly seen is a deeply human need, and it does not fade with age. In fact, it becomes more important. As time becomes more precious, so does the desire to spend it meaningfully. And for many women, that means reevaluating the relationship that has been at the center of their adult lives. So what do we do with this knowledge? How do we begin to move from quiet resentment to understanding, from emotional distance to warmth, if possible? It starts gently with communication, but not the kind we're used to. This isn't about nagging or blaming or dredging up a decade's worth of complaints. It's about speaking from a place of truth and tenderness. Saying things like, "I've been feeling lonely and I miss feeling close to you." Or, "I don't want us to spend our last years together feeling like strangers. Now, I understand this kind of openness can feel frightening, especially if it's been missing from your relationship for a long time. But sometimes, one honest moment can spark a ripple effect." I've seen husbands who seemed emotionally unavailable for decades soften when their wives finally spoke not from anger, but from vulnerability, and sometimes the response is silence or defensiveness. That's painful, but even then, speaking your truth can bring clarity. It shows you that you are showing up for yourself, that you're no longer hiding your feelings under layers of politeness or emotional labor. Let me pause here for a moment and tell you, wherever you are on this journey, whether you're married, widowed, divorced, or in a relationship that feels more like roommates than lovers, you are not alone. Millions of women are navigating the emotional complexities of aging in relationships. It's not talked about often, but it's real. And your feelings matter. In fact, acknowledging these feelings may be one of the most important emotional steps you take in this season of life. Not to blame or to fix everything overnight, but to honor the truth of your experience. There's such power in simply naming what's been left unspoken. So if you've ever found yourself irritated by your husband for reasons you can't quite articulate, or if you've noticed a cooling of affection and aren't sure why, know that this isn't about failure. It's about transition, about reaching a stage of life where emotional needs refuse to be ignored any longer. And that's not a bad thing. It's a sign of growth. Now let's talk about what often lies beneath that growing emotional distance. One of the most overlooked truths is that aging itself changes our emotional landscape. With age comes clarity about who we are, what we want, and what we're no longer willing to tolerate. Women especially begin to reclaim parts of themselves they may have set aside for decades. After years of prioritizing family, household, and social expectations, many older women begin to turn inward and ask, "What about me?" And that question can be both liberating and frightening. Liberating because it opens the door to self-discovery. Frightening because it can expose just how emotionally lopsided some marriages have been. For many women, realizing how little attention they've received from their spouse, not just physically, but mentally and emotionally, can feel like a quiet heartbreak that never got words. Think of it this way. When we're younger, we often put our needs on hold in the name of partnership. We compromise. We stay busy. We avoid conflict. But as we age and the distractions fall away, kids are grown, careers have slowed, social obligations lessen. Left with ourselves and the person we chose to spend our life with. And if that relationship hasn't grown alongside us, the cracks become easier to see. Many women begin to notice patterns. Maybe their husband doesn't ask about their thoughts or feelings. Maybe he avoids emotional conversations or dismisses concerns with a joke or silence. And over time, these small acts of emotional dismissal can create a canyon between two people who once shared everything. I once heard a story from a woman named Judith, who told me she felt like a ghost in her own marriage. We sit at the table together, eat our meals, watch the news. But it's like we're living parallel lives. When I asked her if she had ever tried to bring it up, she nodded slowly. A few times. But he just shrugs it off. He says, "We've made it this far, haven't we?" As if surviving is the same thing as connecting. That phrase stuck with me. Surviving versus connecting. How many long marriages have simply survived, not thrived, not evolved, but just endured? But here's the heart of the issue: women, as they age, don't want to just endure. They want connection. They want someone to look across the table and see them not just as a wife or a fixture in the house, but as a woman with thoughts, dreams, and emotions still fully alive. Some people call this the emotional awakening of older age. Others call it a midlife or late life renaissance. Whatever the name, it's very real. And it's not something to fear. In fact, it's something to honor. But what happens when this awakening is met with emotional absence? When a woman reaches for connection and her partner seems disinterested, withdrawn, or even resistant, this is where emotional misalignment begins to feel like dislike. What starts as disappointment slowly morphs into resentment. And if left unspoken, that resentment can harden into bitterness. Not always loud or angry, but a quiet erosion of affection. Sometimes it shows up as irritation, sometimes as distance, and sometimes as a deep sadness women carry in silence, believing it's just part of growing old. But it doesn't have to be. Let me be clear. Not every relationship can be saved, and not every man is willing or able to meet his partner emotionally. But some are. Some simply need guidance, time, and vulnerability to help them unlearn old habits and build new bridges. One key to this is what psychologist Dr. Sue Johnson, creator of emotionally focused therapy, calls emotional responsiveness. In her book, Hold Me Tight, she explains that the foundation of secure, loving relationships isn't grand gestures, it's the ability to turn toward each other emotionally. To respond to bids for attention, comfort, or connection with warmth, not indifference. Kind of responsiveness can be taught. It can be modeled. And yes, it can be requested. Kindly, clearly, and without shame. That means saying things like, "I want us to feel close again. I miss the way we used to laugh together. I don't need you to fix anything. I just want you to listen." Those words can feel scary to say at first, but they open the door to something so many long-term couples forget to prioritize: emotional intimacy. And if you're thinking, "But my husband's not the emotional type," I hear you. Many men were raised to believe emotions were weak, that vulnerability was something to avoid. But that doesn't mean they're incapable of change. It just means they might need a little help and a safe, non-judgmental space to try. That's why sometimes it helps to involve a third party, whether it's a counselor, therapist, or even a trusted family friend. Not to solve the problem, but to facilitate a conversation that's been too hard to have alone. And sometimes, even without formal help, change can begin with one honest, heartfelt talk. I once heard of a couple married for 53 years who sat down one afternoon and asked each other, "What do you need more of from me?" It was the first real emotional conversation they'd had in years. It didn't fix everything overnight, but it gave them a starting point. If nothing else, it reminded them that they were still capable of growing together even after all that time. Now you might be wondering, what if I've already had the conversation? What if I've tried and nothing changed? That's a real and painful possibility. And if that's your experience, please hear this. Your efforts still matter. You showed up with honesty. You tried to connect. And while we can't control another person's willingness to meet us, we can control how we choose to move forward. That might mean setting boundaries. It might mean seeking out connection in other healthy relationships through friends, community, or even spiritual life. It might mean cultivating joy in new routines or hobbies that remind you of your worth. The goal isn't to shame your partner or yourself. The goal is to reclaim your emotional well-being. Because disliking your spouse as you age isn't a moral failure, it's often a sign that your heart is asking for more. More presence, more understanding, more care, and you're allowed to ask for that. There's a quiet grief that comes with unmet emotional needs, especially in the later stages of life. It's the grief of what could have been. The realization that decades passed with certain parts of you unseen, unexpressed, or unappreciated. And many women carry this grief silently, thinking they're being dramatic, ungrateful, or too emotional. But grief doesn't only come from loss, it also comes from longing. And it's okay to grieve what you needed and didn't receive. One woman I spoke with, Linda, put it perfectly. She said, "I gave him the best of me. I gave him my energy, my youth, my patience, my sacrifices. And now, all I want is for him to know who I am today, not just who I was 40 years ago." That sentiment is so common, yet so rarely spoken aloud. We change with time. We evolve. And it hurts when the person closest to us doesn't evolve with it. Or doesn't seem to notice that we've changed at all. This is especially true for women who spent many years as caregivers. If you were the glue that held everything together, raising children, managing the household, caring for aging parents, you may have placed your own emotional needs on the back burner. Now, with more time and space, those needs finally rise to the surface. And when they go unmet, that unmet emotional hunger can easily translate into resentment. But here's the hopeful part. Recognizing these emotions is the first step toward reclaiming your peace. There's no shame in wanting more. And more doesn't always mean leaving your partner. Sometimes it simply means rebuilding the relationship with new honesty, new boundaries, and new priorities. Other times, it means shifting your focus toward nurturing yourself, rather than waiting for someone else to do it. There's a beautiful quote by Cheryl Richardson that says, "People start to heal the moment they feel heard." And I'd add, healing also begins when you allow yourself to hear your own truth. When you stop pushing down your frustration or pretending things are fine just to keep the peace. When you acknowledge what's really going on in your heart and stop judging yourself for feeling it. Some women find strength in journaling, writing down their emotions, their unmet needs, their hopes, even their disappointments. Others turn to friends, spiritual communities, or support groups where they can share their experiences without fear of judgment. These spaces help remind you that you are not alone in your feelings. In fact, what you're experiencing is part of a much larger pattern among aging women in long-term relationships. That's because emotional maturity deepens with age. And emotional maturity craves depth. We're less interested in small talk and more drawn to real conversations. We're less tolerant of surface-level relationships and more focused on authentic connection. And if your partner can't or won't meet you in that space, the disconnection becomes increasingly painful. But I want to be clear, feeling disconnected doesn't mean you've failed. It doesn't mean you've wasted your life or that the love was never real. It simply means that now, in this season, you're becoming more attuned to what you need. And that awareness is a gift. What happens next is entirely up to you. Some women choose to gently invite their husbands into this emotional space with compassion and patience. Others decide to create new forms of connection elsewhere with grandchildren, friendships, or even a new passion they never had time to explore before. And yes, some women choose emotional separation, even if they remain physically under the same roof. There's no one right answer. But there is one right to claim, the right to feel emotionally fulfilled. You've spent decades giving. It's not selfish to want something in return. It's not wrong to want your golden years to be emotionally rich, not just physically comfortable. Let's also talk for a moment about forgiveness. Not the kind that dismisses pain or asks you to forget, but the kind that frees you from carrying resentment. If your partner was emotionally distant for decades, that wound is real. And forgiving him doesn't mean excusing the pain, it means choosing not to let it define you anymore. It means recognizing that emotional limitations in another person often have nothing to do with your worth. Sometimes, men show love differently, through action instead of words, through presence instead of poetry. And sometimes that love is still real, it just never reached you in the language you needed. Understanding that can bring some peace, even if it doesn't solve everything. If your husband is open, try introducing small changes. Share an article that resonates with your feelings. Invite him on a walk and talk not about chores or schedules, but about memories and feelings. Ask open-ended questions like, "What's something you've never told me, even after all these years?" Or, "What's been the hardest part of growing older for you?" These kinds of questions invite depth and allow space for mutual vulnerability. It won't always work. And it won't always be easy. But sometimes, just starting that conversation can breathe new life into a tired relationship. And if your partner isn't willing to engage, then give yourself permission to emotionally invest elsewhere. Find people who nourish you. Activities that delight you. Moments that remind you of who you are outside of your marriage. You are not only a wife. You are a woman with a story, a soul, and a heart that still beats for connection. That desire doesn't disappear with age. In fact, it often becomes sharper, more essential. This stage of life is not the ending. It's a powerful, sacred chapter all its own. A time when truth can finally be spoken. When love can be redefined. When healing can begin not just with others, but within yourself. So if you've ever asked yourself, why am I starting to feel this way about my husband? The answer is simple, but profound. Because you are awakening to your own emotional truth. And truth is never something to fear. It's something to honor. You've carried so much for so long. Isn't it time to be carried too? Even if that means by your own two hands, lifting yourself gently into a season of clarity, connection, and compassion. You are worthy of being seen, of being heard, of being deeply loved, not just in memory, but in this very moment. Let that be the legacy of your later years. Not quiet resignation, but courageous self-recognition.